represent the normal picture of Essenes that people have. But one thing I think they would not tolerate. Esther shows a Jewish woman marrying a foreigner in order to save her people. Well, the scrolls actually would not even consider that a Jewish woman should marry a foreigner or to be part of his harem just so his people could be saved, because as far as they're concerned, they're very strict on these things. She would have been involved in fornication from the get-go. Basically, she sold herself to this foreign ruler, and the scroll people would not have thought there was anything admirable about that having been done, whereas Pharisaic Judaism, which was more accommodating to foreign rule, would have seen this as basically a very virtuous act. And so the Pharisees, Rabbinic Judaism, the Pharisees, Rabbinic Judaism to be, includes a book like Esther in their writings. I think the reason Esther is missing from here is this group by no means would have countenanced a book like Esther as being something admirable or recommendable. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does.
In their eyes, she would just be basically a fornicator.
Were these Essenes or Zealots?
Well, that's what the argument has been in Dead Sea Scrolls from the beginning. The DeVoe people, since they got control of the manuscripts, laid down in conjunction with some other professors, most of them at Harvard, Frank Moore Cross and others who were here in Palestine when the scrolls came in, developed a network, being all part of the editing team. And nobody was allowed to be in the editing team who didn't adhere to their original assumption that these were Essenes. Now, people like me do not have anything against these being Essenes, as long as we define Essenes by what these documents themselves say, not by what people think Essenes are. In other words, if you have an idea, which these gentlemen mostly had, many of them were members of orders or clerical background of one kind or another, certainly ministers, even Professor Cross, I think, originally had a theological training. Certainly DeVoe and his French Catholic assistant from Poland, Father Milik, who did most of his translating for him. He was a good translator of manuscript. These were people who were actually belonged to the Dominican order, which is a very severe order, and I hate to say, but in the Middle Ages were the people who ran the Inquisition, but that's neither here nor there. You can cut that out if you don't like that. But the point is, they vetted everything when it came in, and they didn't, since the Jordanian government had given them absolute power from 1952 onwards, they didn't allow anyone on the so-called International Committee who didn't agree with their views. So the Essene theory became the official theory. The problem is, these scrolls did have Essene characteristics: purity-mindedness, bathing habits, references to the Holy Spirit, things like this, but that also had an extremely aggressive militancy. And what was clear from the beginning of looking at the documents, which makes the Copper Scroll so interesting, they had a political agenda too. They were not apolitical. They were not uninterested in politics. But one thing they could not abide, and all the documents are consistent on this, they could not abide foreign armies in the country. So this was really a national revolutionary movement as well as being an Essene movement. And you have to go by the documents. And the interesting thing about the documents, some have said, oh, this is just a collection of documents. Norman Gold from the University of Chicago is well known. That's his single theory, that this is a collection of Jerusalem writings. No, this is not a collection of simply a Jerusalem writing. Some of them may have been penned there. These writings are consistent across the board. You never get a compromising document here. You never get an accommodating document here. You never get one approving of Roman rule or foreign rule in Palestine. You never get one approving of foreign appointed high priests. You never get one approving of fornication, of niece marriage, of polygamy, of the king marrying a non-Jewish woman. I mean, these are like consistent down the line. So, let's go to the bottom line. What have we said? They are a combination of Essenes and Zealots. Well, we get these terminologies from a Jewish historian of the first century called Josephus. And in Josephus' work, he outlines the different groups. Well, it turns out Josephus wrote several works where he changes his discussion. Josephus turns out to be a very slippery person. Some works he wrote in the 70s when he felt less secure, having been a turncoat and cooperating with the Roman imperial family from which he got his name Flavius. He was the original Ben-Hur. He was adopted into the Roman imperial family and given their name Flavians, because they were the new imperial family that succeeded the Julio Claudians. So he was Flavius. But in the 90s, when he wrote his second work, his autobiography and his Antiquities, he felt much more secure in his position, obviously, and lots of data that he didn't include in the Jewish War in the 70s, he refined and refurbished in the 90s. So suddenly he's willing to tell us much more about the Zealot movement in the 90s than he is in the 70s. In the 70s, he promises to talk about the Zealot movement, but doesn't do it. In the 90s, he cuts a whole segment from his description of the Essenes in the 70s and puts it under his description of the Zealots in the 90s. So we see there's some fluidity of taking what the actual groups were. Finally, there's another version of Josephus that oddly was concerned by a curious manuscript attributed to a church father, Hippolytus, in Rome in the 3rd century. And this is clearly from Josephus. And there, Hippolytus says, and I think this is the truth of the situation, clearly quoting Josephus, there were 4 groups of Essenes. There were normative Essenes, there were Essene Zealots, there were Essene, or Zealot Essenes, there were Sicarii Essenes, and there was a 4th group. I forget what the 4th group was. But that means he recognized groups that combine characteristics of both. Now the Sicarii Essenes really are interesting, because the Sicarii Essenes, which I think Qumran really represents, are the kind of people that Josephus hates in his work, that he calls, Sicarii means Roman short sword. It can also mean the circumciser's knife. It was the curved kind of knife that you even see Bedouins today carry across their breasts when you go down to the Arabian Peninsula. It was originally the Roman short sword, but it had a curve to it. It was also for Josephus a sword of the assassin, or the knife of the assassins, who mingled in the 50s among the crowds in Jerusalem and assassinated their political adversaries. A little bit like Hamas or something now, and or Hezbollah or something like that. It also turns out that these Sicarii, the name is from Josephus, it is pejorative because it means knife people. I'm sure they didn't call themselves knife people. They had a different name for themselves, maybe Zealot Essenes. They certainly didn't call themselves knife people. That's Josephus's pejorative word. They're the ones who, it turns out, fled Jerusalem in the middle of the uprising and took Masada. And they're the ones who held out on Masada until long after Jerusalem fell, and we'll go down to Masada and look at it, until 73, where they committed mass suicide in the Japanese samurai style. Killed all their families rather than allow the Romans take them prisoner, killed themselves, some 1,000 some odd men, women, and children. You say, what was the reason for that? The reason for that is, rather than give their women and children